I discovered a really cool technique for separating bus distorted material into individual stems. And while it's possible someone has discovered this before me, I can't find this method anywhere else, so I'm guessing I'm the first. I want to warn you in advance that this technique is pretty experimental, and it does have a flaw. That flaw being that the stems you get as a result of this will have some bleed in them. And since this method has this flaw, and also since this method is pretty complex, I do feel the need to justify its existence a bit, so I will spend part of this video explaining the flaws of every other way that you could approach this problem, at least that I could think of, and in the end, perhaps you may find that my solution is the best for your situation, or maybe not. However, if you're in a hurry, just skip to this timestamp here and I'll get straight to the point. Here's a project I have. It's got a kick track, a snare and clap track, a cymbals track, a tom track, and a synth track, and it sounds like this. Now, because this isn't dirty enough for me, I've decided to route all of these tracks into this bus down here where I've placed a single distortion plugin. And now it sounds like this. Much better. But really though, if you're making music that sounds like this, then this distortion is probably a musical choice. In fact, you've probably put this distortion in place long before you've entered the mixing phase because you view it as part of the music, not as part of the mix. But now you need to enter the mixing phase, and to prepare for this, you normally need to bounce out all the stems. And here we run into our problem, because if you solo all these tracks individually, and then bounce them out and put them together again, it's not going to sound the same as it does right now. I will call this flawed method number 1. If you do this, you end up with the same effect as distorting each of these tracks individually rather than the sum of their parts. This creates a different sound because distortion does not have the distributive property. What I mean by that is simply this. Distortion of A plus B plus C plus D plus E is not equal to distortion of A plus distortion of B plus distortion of C, etc. A way I like to think about it is that each of these tracks has dependencies on each other as a result of being bus distorted together. Each of these tracks will not sound the way it should unless all the other tracks are playing simultaneously. For instance, if I solo just the kick and the synth, notice how the kick kind of breaks up the synth, almost like it's sidechaining it? But now if I only play the synth doesn't have that pumping quality at all. So if bouncing them out individually is not going to work, you could do what I imagine most people do, which is to keep this same routing structure and same distortion plugin when you mix. This is flawed method number 2. The problem with this is since distortion is heavily dependent on input level, and since all these tracks are dependent on each other, any change you make to each of these tracks while you're mixing is going to change the way the distortion sounds. For instance, let's say when you're mixing, you think the kick should be quieter, for a purely practical reason, like maybe it's burying something else. But by turning down the kick, you're going to actually decrease the amount of that pumping sidechain effect in the synth that I mentioned earlier. And remember, you like that aspect of the sound for its musical quality. So I don't know about you, but I don't even want to worry about changing musical qualities of my song while I'm mixing it. I want the music composition and the mixing to be two totally separate parts of the process. So again, that's a flawed approach. And so is another similar approach, which is flawed method number 3. This is if you're sending these stems to a mix engineer, you bounce some clean versions of all these tracks and then send them a demo of what they should sound like when summed together and distorted, as well as tell them what distortion you used and what parameters. Now this might lead to a problem if they don't have the same distortion plugin as you, since they'll have to recreate your distortion sound from scratch using a different plugin and it won't be exactly the same. Even if they do have your plugin and follow your instructions to a T, they're still going to have the same problem in flawed method number 2, except now they have to deal with this problem instead of you. Maybe they'll figure it out and they'll keep your artistic vision intact. Maybe they won't. We are almost at the part of the video where I get to talk about the method for solving this problem that I discovered, but first, it's really important that you understand polarity flipping and null testing. If you're unfamiliar with that sort of thing, my solution won't make much sense, but if you already know that stuff, skip to the timestamp here. So here I have a totally different song pulled up just to demonstrate this stuff. We have a conga, a shaker, a piano, and a guitar, and there's no bus distortion or anything. It sounds like this. And while that's the best song you've ever heard in your entire life, we do need to focus. So I'm going to route all of these into an aux track. I'm also going to send all of them to another aux track. And now we have two aux tracks that should be putting out identical outputs. I'm going to create tracks for them because I like to see them over here as well. Now if we solo between these, you'll obviously hear that they sound exactly the same, but we can actually prove that they're exactly the same. The way that we can do this is by putting a polarity flip on one of them. So the way you do that in Logic is by pulling up a gain plugin and just checking these two boxes here for phase invert left and right. And then as we play these two at the same time now, we hear silence, perfect silence. And you know it's perfect silence because you look over here at the stereo out and there's no meter happening whatsoever. Now the reason this happens is pretty mathematically straightforward. Basically this is our aux 1, it has 4 instruments, and this is our aux 2, which is the exact same except for it's negative because we flipped the polarity. This is the same thing as basically just saying this minus itself, and anything minus itself is obviously going to be 0, aka silence. This kind of experiment is called a null test and can be used to check if two pieces of audio are exactly the same. If they're not exactly the same, a null test will tell you what the difference between them is. For instance, let's make a difference between them. Let's go over here and turn down the send on the guitar. Now this guitar will still be outputting to bus 1, but it won't be sending any audio to bus 2, and thus there is a difference between these two aux tracks now. The equation that represents this looks like this. If D is guitar, then this is the equation. This is aux 1, and this is aux 2. So what does this leave us with? Yes, D, which is the grade you would get for not showing your work. Sure enough, we go back here, we play, and we just hear the guitar. But how can we apply this to solve the problem of this video, which if you don't remember, is to separate a distorted bus into usable stems? Okay, here's the song we started with. We have 5 tracks. They're all put into a bus here that has a distortion plugin on it. For the people who skipped to this timestamp, I guess I should play this again. So basically this is what we're hearing. I'm going to call everything that we're hearing S. S is equal to the distortion of A plus B plus C plus D plus E, right? And what we're trying to do is separate S into 5 stems that when added together create S. I'm giving them stars because remember, these aren't actually A, B, C, D, and E. A, B, C, D, and E are here. These are clean versions of all these tracks. That's what they represent. So what are these starred variables? Well, we're going to make them right now. So we're going to say A star is equal to the distortion of A through E minus the distortion of B through E. Now, this is not the same thing as the distortion of A. Because remember, distortion doesn't have the distributive property, so you can't make that assumption. All we can say is that it's equal to A star, which is like some weird version of A. Then we're going to say B star is equal to distortion of B through E minus distortion of C through E. Then we're going to say C star is equal to distortion of C through E minus the distortion of D through E. D star will be equal to the distortion of D and E minus the distortion of E. E star is equal to the distortion of E. Now you might not be following me at all right now, but all I've done is basically just create A star through E star, and it actually does satisfy this equation here. And in order to prove that it's pretty easy. You'd basically just plug in these values for A star through E star, these big, long, ugly values. You just plug these in, and you'd basically just get S equal to the distortion of A through E because a bunch of stuff cancels out, and thus we have created A star through E star that satisfies this equation, so moving on. But this is the process. We basically are just isolating these stems each just one step at a time using these clever null tests to return close versions of all these stems. Now, as I mentioned before, the only downside to this method is that each track will have a little bit of bleed from other tracks, but even though there will be bleed, the tracks will all sum up to the original sound of the song, as I just proved mathematically. Furthermore, you can minimize this bleed by isolating the tracks in the right order. A rule of thumb that I've been using is to start with the higher frequency tracks and to end with the lower frequency tracks, but along the way, you might decide to change that order depending on how much bleed you're hearing. Keep in mind that the last track you isolate will always have no bleed whatsoever. So following our high frequency first rule, the first track we should isolate is the cymbals. But before we do that, I need to set this up so that I can actually isolate things. So the way this is going to work is that I'm going to send each of these tracks to another bus. This aux is going to be the same thing as this one, except for this one will have its polarity flipped. For less confusion, I'll just call this one aux1, and then this one we just created will be aux2. And I'll also call it flipped, so we remember that it's flipped, and we can create a track for this. And now we have aux1, aux2 flipped. So far, they should be the same, and if we play, there should be silence. And there is. So now let's make the cymbals isolation, or the A star, so to speak. So again, A star is equal to distort A through E minus distort B through E. So basically we need to just not include the cymbals in aux2, and we can do that by just turning down this bus here. And now we can hear what that sounds like. Sounds fine to me. I'll just make another audio track. Make this stereo. We're going to record onto this audio track to make these stems. So I will give it an input here, bus 3, and then I'm going to take these guys, and this is what we're going to use to record onto it. Bus 3. Now, I'll call this isolated cymbals. And now if we record, we should record the isolated cymbals. Stupid metronome. And now you hear that there is some bleed, but it wasn't really that bad, so I'm kind of fine with using that as my first isolated track. And now in order to get the next isolated track, it's sort of the same deal, except for this doesn't involve track A at all. So that basically means that we can just mute the track that we just isolated, and then we can turn the bus down on the next track we want to isolate, and I'm going to try to isolate the synth next. I can mute that, call this isolated synth, and record. Now, I'm kind of hearing that there's more bleed from the snare and clap that I would really like here, so I'm going to see if I can actually isolate the snare and clap next, and hopefully that'll sound better. So I'm going to go back, decide that I actually want this bus to be up. The bus that I want to turn down is actually snare and clap. And then we'll call this isolated snare and clap. Cool, now that that's done, let's probably do the synth next. So we'll mute the snare and clap. We will turn down the bus on the synth. And now we'll call this isolated synth and hit record. And now that that's out of the way, let's go back here to get the next one, which will be the tom. So I'll turn down the bus on the tom. Oh, first of all, we'll mute the synth because we just did that and it's not relevant anymore. Then we'll go back here and make another track. We'll call this isolated tom. We'll hit record. Ooh, actually, I don't like that because we are basically getting bleed from the kick, and I just feel like we could avoid that. Really, the tom part, all it sounds like is this. It's not ba-dum-bum, it's just ba-dum. And so let's try actually isolating the kick next instead of the tom. So we'll go back here and we will turn up the bus on the tom, and we'll actually turn it down on the kick. And let's see how this sounds like. There's a little bit of bleed, but it happens at the same time as the kick, so I don't... Yeah, there's a little bit of bleed from the tom, but it happens at the same time as the kick, so I don't think it's actually really a big deal at all. And then now we'll finally isolate the tom. Same thing, now you mute the kick, and now you turn down the bus and the tom. And actually this last one is going to be identical to just the distorted tom. And we'll have no bleed whatsoever. So there you have it. Now we have 5 tracks. And they all will sum up to be the exact same thing as the mix. Here's what they sound like all together. In fact, we can prove that it sounds exactly the same as it did going in by doing a null test. So we can take this, which is, again, our original mix of tracks with the distortion plugin on and everything, and we can just flip it. And let's play this with all of the stems we just created. And of course, I gotta unmute all of these going into the aux track. And sure enough, we play this aux track, which was what we originally had, with all these stems at the same time. Yay, it's silence. Look here, there's no meter. There's nothing on the stereo out. We're getting total silence. That means they're the same. And yet we also rendered it into 5 different independent audio tracks that can be mixed independently. I think that's cool as shit. So there you have it. Yes, each track has some bleed now, but your mix engineer has probably seen worse. Plus, I bet someone could come up with a way to modify this technique to reduce bleed even further. If you think of anything, let me know. Anyways, I've literally never made a video tutorial before, so if you think I didn't sound like an insane person, let me know in the comments, but if you think I sounded like an insane person, maybe just keep that to yourself. Anyways, peace.